This is rather a long title, and hopefully not a long sermon, but a long title. It's entitled, The Anticipated Messiah and Expectant Mother. And I have a purpose, and I want to start. The purpose is not in your notes, but I have a purpose that I want us to understand today. And that is that God has blessed us so greatly. But like Mary and the birth of Jesus, we live in a world that suppresses our anticipation, suppresses our excitement, suppresses our hope, and suppresses our joy. And when we begin to recognize that, we think, for example, how different if the whole world had an appreciation for God, had an understanding of Jesus, what would these days be like leading up to what we celebrate in Christmas and in the Advent, in the coming of Christ, the incarnation of God? I would just suggest to us that all of our lives would be excitingly much more different. But there is a damper on all of this. The damper on Advent, the damper on celebration. And what I want to talk about is how that there is anticipation. We are people of anticipation, both presently and also for the future. There is so much that we anticipate in terms of the future. And what we see here, and what we want to look at today, is what it must have been like for Mary as she anticipated the hope of the Messiah, and then finding herself as the central figure for the birth of Jesus. Mary did not come up with this idea all on her own. And when we look at this, we recognize that the anticipated Messiah, Jesus is the Messiah. Jesus is the incarnation of God, the Emmanuel. Jesus is the hope of Israel. And when we think about anticipation, I want us to go back here before we look in, and we're going to look at Luke chapter 1 today. But when we go back to the book of Isaiah, what Isaiah had written was paramount on the minds of Israel. It was paramount because of the hope and the promise that they had. So in Isaiah chapter 9 and verse 6, we read this. And I'm sure that most Israelites recognize this. It was like, the day is near, surely God is going to intervene. But in Isaiah chapter 9 and verse 6, it's for to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. So you have this prophecy, and what a delightful prophecy, and what a hopeful thing for those who were Israelites at that time. Of the increase of his government and peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this. So now I want us to understand that I know there had to be a zeal for Israel looking forward to, as we oftentimes hear people say, next year Jerusalem. People are talking about the coming of the Lord. But also the zeal that God himself had for the accomplishing of this task, of this happening. And it's an excited anticipation, both by Israel and by God. And then the absolute statement that God is excited and he will perform this. This will happen. So for hundreds of years, from the prophecy of Isaiah there on to the actual birth of Christ, people were anticipating. Now, one thing that Mary didn't anticipate, that it would be her. No way that she anticipated that happening. Now, when we think about the anticipating, Mary anticipated in her life, what was she anticipating? She was anticipating the marriage to Joseph. Her life was kind of exciting. She was about to be married to this man that she loved. I'm just making that assumption, but I think it's a very accurate assumption for several reasons. One of which is that Mary was favored in God's sight. And this is one of the things that we're going to read. I think in terms of woman, in terms of a wife, Mary, she was incredibly prepared for that in that way in terms of her attitude. Now, Isaiah chapter 7 verse 14 tells us that Mary, that a virgin would conceive and bear a son. Well, again, I'm saying that this idea of a virgin conceiving in and of itself would be, in all of our minds, an impossibility for that to happen. So I'm guessing that most Israelites are wondering, well, how is this going to be done? And when is this going to be done? And all of these things. But again, Mary is not thinking it's going to be her. So much of the Bible speaks of the hope of Israel and all of mankind and the coming of the Messiah. I would suggest that the thinking about this is rather short-term, though, and rather limited. Now, when we think about the Messiah, what we know about the Messiah and what we know about the thinking of the Israelites was that the Messiah would come and deliver and restore Israel. And I'm not sure how much thinking went beyond that. That he would come, he would restore Israel, David's throne would be restored, they would be a prominent nation in the world, and everyone would look up to them in that regard. Now, this promise, and we talk about anticipation. So I want to go back as far back as we can go in terms of this particular promise being in the Bible, of what we know anyway in this promise. And that goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15. Now, one may not it's kind of a mind stretch for this, but all theologians who look at this agree that this is a prophecy about the coming of the Messiah, about the seed of God. But in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15, this is after Satan had they had taken the fruit and all of this, but it says here in verse 15, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. This is a reference to the birth of Jesus. This is a reference to what Jesus would do. Now, how do we know that? And how can we, are there any other allusions to this as well in the New Testament? Well, there are. In Romans chapter 16, the Apostle Paul uses this example that we find here, and the wording is almost exactly the same. Romans chapter 16 and verse 20. Again, speaking of this prophecy, here's what Paul writes to them in verse 20. He tells them here, the God of peace will soon crush Satan under your feet. The grace of our Lord Jesus be with you. This is, again, almost the same terminology that you find in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15. With that thought in mind, the author of the book of Hebrews also writes to us in Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 14, in Hebrews 2 and verse 14, where it talks about the incarnation and it says here, since the children have flesh and blood, he too shared in their humanity, so that by his death he might destroy him who holds the power. Again, crush, step on his head, bruise his feet, his heel, that have power to destroy, who has power of death, that in the devil, and to free those who all of their lives have been held in slavery by the fear of death.
The world today is a challenging environment for Christian believers and followers of Jesus Christ. Looking for answers? Grace Communion International local churches in Fairfield, Santa Rosa, and Modesto offers a comforting environment for Christians in search of spiritual growth and development. Contact our local ministry. Attend our local GCI churches at the times listed on your screen.